Let's go to Kelly in Guam, right down the street in Guam. Kelly, what's going on?
Hi, Dr. D. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Thanks for waiting so long while I was ranting about digital detoxes. How are we doing?
I'm okay. I'm calling today about my beautiful 17-and-a-half-year-old baby girl.
All right.
So her teenage years have been a little rough for the family, but particularly on me. In the last 3.5 years, we've dealt with 2 pregnancy scares. And we've had to work through those things as a family with Christian values. She's not pregnant, but after working through these events as a family and as a mother and daughter, I find that now moving forward, I'm always suspicious of her now. The most recent scare was just this July.
Okay.
And I'm struggling with always suspecting her of wrongdoing, even when she's innocent. And since this last pregnancy scare, she's actually done really well in honoring our boundaries and our values. And I've explained to her that my trust is very fragile. Mm-hmm. But I'm just always suspicious, and I don't want to spend the last 5 months of her childhood life with me suspicious of her. And I also don't want that to leak over into my 10-year-old son who's coming up into adolescence. So hoping for some advice.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for your trust here. I appreciate that, man. That's cool. So there's several things here. Let's back all the way up. So you said you got Christian values of your home, and so one of those values I'm going to assume is that you don't want your teenage daughter out having sex with other people, right?
Correct.
Okay. So when you say there was 2 pregnancy scare events, that sounds like a drum roll and fireworks and lightning. Like, tell me what you mean when you say events. Did you catch her with somebody, or did she come home and have a hard conversation with you and say, "Hey, Mom, I think I'm pregnant"? Did she have a pregnancy test that she passed? Like, tell me what the event was.
Okay, so the first one was the more chaotic one. I actually didn't know what had happened for over a year. When she was as young as just turning 15, she became very angry, depressed, dealt with self-harm. It was just really difficult. I didn't know what was going on. I got her counseling, and for a year, I just worked through this child who I basically didn't know anymore. I had to do some work on my own self to connect with her better. Anyways, after a year of this, of counseling, of boundaries, of working together, with technology, exactly what you've said about technology, I had to cut her off of technology for over a year. We found out she was inappropriately interacting with this boy via technology, and so her dad got involved and contacted his parents, and we basically cut them off. She was barely 15. So a year later, after all of this, she finally told me, "Mom, I slept with him." And she was like, "I got pregnant and I miscarried," which I cannot medically confirm because it was a year later, and I don't even know if she knew what that meant.
Right.
And so, it was a huge upset. It dramatically affected our family, but like I said, we did a lot of hard work. And so this last event in July, it was just one of those. She came home and was like, "Mom, I'm late for my menstruation. I took a pregnancy test. It was negative." And I was like, "Oh, my God, honey, well, those could be inaccurate." So we spent the weekend. I took her to the doctor, and I spent the weekend crying, basically, waiting for those results. Those results came back negative. After that, me and her father sat her down, and we went over what our personal values were, where we stood, but the fact that she's almost an adult and she's going to make these decisions, she's going to have to deal with them. And so that's basically how they unfolded. So the second event wasn't, I don't want to say, it wasn't as traumatic, if you will, but still it affected me greatly.
And so before I leave the first one, that's not a pregnancy scare.
Okay.
If a 15-year-old got pregnant and miscarried, that is a deep, deep trauma.
Yes.
Okay, so that's not a pregnancy scare event. I don't know any adult in my life who hasn't had some sort of pregnancy scare, even if they're married with a couple of kids, right?
Yeah.
That goes with the territory. That's not what your daughter experienced. I have met with teenagers over the years who become sexually active at a young age, and they go through a whole series of depressive episodes of, like you mentioned, cutting, self-harm stuff. because there's a disconnect between the physical and the hormonal and then the emotional, and it just becomes a tidal wave for especially young teens. And then you throw into that, whether if she was truly pregnant and truly miscarried, that's a loss of, I don't know if you've experienced that, but that's a loss of unimaginable depth that a 15-year-old just doesn't have the psychological wiring to handle. I don't know any adult that has the psychological wiring to handle that on their own without a community, right? And so I want to characterize that the right way. So then fast forward, when she came to you and said, Mom, I'm late, and you spent the weekend crying, were you crying because your daughter was having sex again, or were you crying because you thought you were going to be a grandma?
So I think my crying had more to do with, like, blaming myself. Like, how did I let this happen to her again? How is this your fault? Well, because I'm her mom, and I mean, I've spent so much time trying to talk to her about the dangers and
but you were 17 too. If a 17-year-old wants to be a 17-year-old, they're going to be a 17-year-old, and so
right.
It's you're taking a lot on if you immediately run to the mirror and say, "What have I done?" I gave her all the information, and we know that, like, sexual activity in teenagers is how they try to connect, right? That's them trying to figure it out. And so, you can put up all kind of fences and stuff. Teenagers, we've got 400 years, we got thousands of years of literature about teenagers figuring it out, right? How to get around walls and barriers and things.
Yes, sir.
And I'm telling you that not to minimize what you went through, but I'm just trying to drill down. It sounds like you felt like you failed.
Yes.
For your teenage daughter, violating your boundaries, true, but acting like a teenage daughter. Mm-hmm. And so I want to get at, were you disappointed in her? Were you heartbroken? Or did you really just land on, I suck as a mom because it happened again? Yeah,
that's where I landed.
Okay. So your tears were more about your perceived failures, not about any situation your daughter was in.
Well, I mean, there was a little bit of, oh my gosh, what about her future, right? You know, of
there
course,
you go.
that,
Okay. All right.
What does that mean for her?
Right.
Of course, but she was very stoic about it. She was like, Mom, I'm gonna do what I have to do if I am pregnant. Like, and I'm of course like, baby, I'm here for you. And she's like, I know, Mom, but I'm gonna do what I got to do. I made this choice. But I mean, a lot of it because of what I went through when she was 14, like it's just.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. I missed an important thing, and I'm going to own that. I missed it. Your daughter dealt with a unimaginable trauma, but you did too. And if you're still characterizing the miscarriage of a future grandkid as a pregnancy scare, that tells me you haven't dealt with it either. And you might still be in the performative aspect of parenting, which is often for evangelical Christian kids. If I can keep them from having sex, drinking beer, and smoking cigarettes or marijuana, I've won. And if they don't say bad words, that's even a bonus on top, right? Yeah. And we lump in those 3 or 4 behaviors, and those are all well and good. Those are all values behaviors. Those all have negative outcomes attached to a lot of them, right? But often we sacrifice connection for trying to, truly connecting with my kid, letting them see what I'm going to model, what these values look like. And it really diminishes the connection because I'm just trying to make sure that this behavior doesn't happen. And I'm all about behavior prohibition for teens. Big time, big time. And I think we have completely swung that pendulum too far the other way, asking 13-year-olds how they feel about things. I don't care. You're 13, right? Yeah. And so I'm with you on those. But you've got to process the trauma too. And I bet your husband does as well. And if you haven't sat down, and you said, I'm really proud of you, you said you did your own work for a year. I hope that some of that healing was from that too. So you've reached an important point that I hope every parent listening to this hears. I hope every wife and every husband and every boss, everyone who's in a relationship with other people. You have a suspicion now. You created a picture of a world that your daughter was going to live into, and she didn't live into it. And you probably put some boundaries on her, like you've got a curfew, you can't go out this time, I don't want you talking to that boy. And somehow she was a 17-year-old, and she found her way around the boundaries and she slept with somebody again. And now you're suspicious of everything. And you also are wise enough to know that living that suspicious life, if you start trying to always be thinking about what's on her phone, what's always in her email accounts, where she might be, where she's not be, I'm going to put my phone tracker app, that you realize that you are distilling a relationship down into a series of points, and she's going to go away in about half a year. She's going to be 18. She's going to be gone. And you're going to realize, I burned that last half of that thing fretting away those moments of connection, right? That's a really astute observation for you as a mom. I hope everyone's listening to this. That when we turn people into our worst fears, we are choosing to disconnect from them. So here's a couple of things I would tell you, and these are just off the top of my head. Number one, you are allowed to have your suspicions. They're real. And my guess is you had some behaviors, expectations of your daughter, which is right and good. I'm glad you did. And she violated them again. And so you're allowed to be suspicious, right? That's a normal thing. I got a 10-year-old and I'm suspicious of him. I got a 5-year-old and I'm super suspicious of her. Right? That's normal and good. Also, your kid's 17. You're allowed to say, let me see your phone. You're allowed to say, where are you going? Call me when you get there. I don't consider that, and this is, I'm going to get mean cards and letters, I don't consider that a quote-unquote invasion of their privacy. They are children. They're children. They have a door on their room because we are nice, not because they quote-unquote deserve it. Okay? So you're allowed to be suspicious. At the same time, you are real close to having an adult in your home. And teaching them that autonomy and teaching them how to lean out of that is important. So here's what I think is the greatest gift you could give your kid. So this is number two. Number one is your suspicions are good. They're fine. Good for you. Number two is finding a way to both be honest with your 17-and-a-half-year-old and wise. And what do I mean by that? Say, when you feel suspicious, sit down with your daughter and say, I'm feeling suspicious. Something's not right in my gut, and I have been wrong over the course of your life. Do I have anything to be suspicious about? And let her speak into it. Okay? And what you're doing is you're showing your daughter vulnerability, you're showing her leadership, you're showing her accountability, and you are saying, I'm going to default to trust even though you violated a few big times. Because it sounds like all the other times she's a pretty good kid, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like you said, you started the whole call with she's beautiful and wonderful, and she's had sex. And so I don't want all those things to be divorced from one another, right? They can all live in that same tension. But by showing her that you love her enough to hold her accountable and you love her enough to be vulnerable and open with her, you're going to model for her what being a parent looks like. You're going to model for her what being a Christian mom looks like, someone who both loves and wants to trust and is still struggling with that moment. And then if you find out that she's lying to you again, you're going to hold her accountable. If you find out that she's violating your core family values, you're going to hold her accountable. And I think being honest with her about that tension, because here's what kids do, okay? Kids feel that tension on their parents, and they backfill that tension with, it's my fault. I suck. I can't make my mom feel right about me. And the way kids interpret that is a violation of a relationship, and it's their fault. And then they set about all kinds of different behaviors and ways of coping with that disconnection. Some kids try to be perfect. Some kids go burn down the neighborhood. Some kids try to get straight A's. Some kids quit going to class. Some kids smoke weed. Some kids go get bunches of girlfriends. Some kids fill in the blank. But kids are always trying to reach out and reconnect and reform those relationships, especially when they feel that gap and that tension with their parents. And so that tension's going to be there when you feel that suspicion. Like she's like, all right, I'll be back at 10. I'm going to study Spanish at Susan's house. And your alarms go off when you're like, bull crap, you're not. Right?
Yeah.
Like you're not. And now you've got a backlog. You've got some things where she's gone to study. So you think. And you also have some data that says sometimes she doesn't go study. Sometimes she goes and hooks up with somebody. Mm-hmm. Right then there's that tension and she feels it. You feel it. You all feel it. And that's when you as the adult, the wise one, get to lean into that and say, all right, let's talk. My suspicion alarms just set off. It might be me, but I was a 17-year-old girl once too, and it might not be. So here's what I think. I think you're going to go do X, Y, and Z, and I feel like I want to look at your phone. When I say that, what do you think? And let her speak into it. And then you get to own the conversation. You get to own the wisdom. You get to own the vulnerability there. And then you let her get to practice being an adult. Is she going to be honest with you? Is she going to tell you the truth, et cetera, et cetera? How does that sound when I say that?
It sounds, along the lines of what I've been working towards.
Awesome.
Because, there was one time, I caught her. She was up at 4 a.m. I was like, what are you doing awake? And so we had this argument, and I was just honest. I said, baby, you have to understand, my trust is very fragile, and we have to work together to fix that. So
one thing I would add, number one, good for you for having the conversation and for leaning into that. Number two, 4 a.m. is never a good time to have existential conversations about trust.
Agreed.
Right? Because then she's exhausted, and that her ability to think clearly and respond appropriately and respectfully is thin, and then your ability to respond respectfully and authentically and wise is thin. That's when you circle back that next weekend or that next night or that evening and say, dude, look, 4:30, no way, dude. No teenager in Guam is just hanging out at 4 a.m. because they're doing math homework, right? They're not, right?
No.
And so I think you're right on the right track. I do. Feel your feelings and just ask them for data, for truth. And if you feel suspicious, trust your gut. You've been right a lot. And lean into wisdom and trust with your daughter. I think that's a good place. And I want to honor the fact that you and your husband set boundaries and values for her. And most of the time she follows them, and a couple of times she hasn't. And you still are defaulting to the fact that you love her. You think she's wonderful. I think giving her good education, and not just scare tactics, but good education, and also being vulnerable where you can about your own story. If you have your own stories, letting her get to see what's in the heart and mind of a good mom and a good wife and a good person just trying to make it through the day. But man, it sounds like y'all are right on the right track, and the more vulnerable you can lean into that while still holding firm to your values and firm to that accountability. Kelly, you're teaching a young kid how to become a young woman, how to become a young adult, and good for you. That young girl's lucky to have you. Wouldn't do 4 a.m. conversations, but she's lucky to have you. That's super, super good.